Sam's kitchen became a fortress where he barricaded himself behind routine and mechanical efficiency. The cornbread disappeared entirely from the menu, replaced by regulation white bread that arrived from the base commissary in uniform slices wrapped in waxed paper, as bland and impersonal as government forms. He continued to prepare meals with the same technical precision he had always demonstrated, portioning exactly, seasoning adequately, ensuring that everything met army standards for nutrition and calorie count. But the indefinable something that separates mere sustenance from actual nourishment had vanished from his cooking. He moved through the kitchen like an automaton, his face expressionless, his responses to other kitchen staff reduced to necessary monosyllables. The warmth that had once infused every dish, that intangible quality that comes from caring about the people who will eat the food you prepare, had been extinguished as thoroughly as if someone had thrown cold water on a campfire. In the women's quarters, a different kind of cold had taken up residence. Greta found herself unable to sleep properly, lying awake on her narrow cot while the darkness pressed down and her mind replayed that scene in the mess hall with increasingly vivid detail. She could see Sam's face with painful clarity, could watch again and again as his expression shifted from anticipation to hurt to carefully controlled anger. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory with the persistence of a song that refuses to be forgotten, speaking words that Mama had repeated countless times throughout Greta's childhood. When someone offers you food, mine kind, you accept it with gratitude, regardless of whether it suits your taste. To reject someone's offering is to reject their humanity, to say that their effort and their care mean nothing to you. Her mother had learned those lessons during the terrible years after the First War, when pride had been a luxury that starving families could not afford, when any food was precious and to turn your nose up at anything edible was an act of supreme foolishness. Greta remembered how they had eaten things during those lean years that she would never have imagined consuming before the war, how her mother had made them eat every scrap and be grateful for it, because the alternative was hunger, and hunger was an enemy that required no army to defeat you. She thought about the expression she had seen on Sam's face, and she recognized it now for what it was. Not the anger of a military superior whose orders had been questioned, not the irritation of a professional whose work had been criticized, but something far more personal and far more painful. It was the look of someone whose gesture of kindness had been thrown back in their face, whose attempt to offer comfort had been mocked by people who had no idea what they were mocking. She had seen that same expression on the faces of her students when their earnest efforts had been met with ridicule from their classmates, when the poems they had written or the problems they had solved on the blackboard had been greeted with laughter instead of encouragement. And she had always moved swiftly to shut down such cruelty in her classroom, to make clear that kindness and effort deserved respect, even when the result fell short of perfection. Margaret Sullivan noticed the change in camp atmosphere with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years managing people and situations. She walked through the facility each morning, observing the rigid formality that had replaced the tentative warmth that had briefly existed, noting the way guards and prisoners moved past each other without making eye contact, how conversations that might have begun remained stillborn in the frigid air of wounded pride and misunderstood intentions. She found herself avoiding the mess hall, unable to bear the sight of Sam moving through his duties with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had shut down every emotion to protect himself from further hurt. Her own gold star seemed to weigh more heavily with each passing day, a constant reminder that loss and sorrow respected no boundaries of nationality or circumstance. The tension might have continued indefinitely, frozen in that miserable stalemate, if not for Margaret's determination to find some way to bridge the gulf that had opened. She began bringing newspapers to the women's quarters, carefully selected editions of the Des Moines Register and other Iowa publications that she judged contained nothing that might compromise security, but which offered windows into American life and culture. She suggested to Greta that the women might benefit from improving their English language skills, that the ability to communicate more effectively with their guards and administrators would make everyone's lives easier. Greta seized on the suggestion with an eagerness that surprised even herself, grateful for something to occupy her mind beyond endless rumination on her failures and regrets. Within days, informal classes had begun in the common area of the women's quarters, with Greta once again standing before a group of students, her natural teaching instincts reasserting themselves after months of dormancy. The women gathered around her each afternoon, their voices creating a gentle murmur as they practiced pronunciation and wrestled with the peculiarities of English grammar. Greta found articles about Iowa farming practices, about corn harvests and crop rotation, about the ways in which this golden grain had become central to the American agricultural economy in ways that wheat never had been in Germany. "Listen carefully to this paragraph," she instructed her students one afternoon, pointing to an article about Iowa farmers donating surplus corn to relief organizations for European refugees. The writer says that corn feeds both animals and people in America, that it is not considered merely livestock fodder the way we might think of it at home. Notice how the English uses feed when talking about both humans and animals, where in German we might use different words for nourishing people versus feeding livestock. She traced the words with her finger, her voice falling into the familiar rhythms of instruction, and found herself remembering why she had loved teaching, how the act of helping someone understand something new could create connection across any divide. From the kitchen, Sam found himself drawn to listen to these lessons, despite his determination to maintain emotional distance. He would position himself near the doorway during afternoon meal preparations, ostensibly checking supplies or wiping down already clean surfaces, but actually listening to Greta's patient explanations and gentle corrections. There was something in her teaching style that reminded him powerfully of his own mother, who had led Sunday school classes in the small Baptist church in Montgomery, with that same combination of firm expectations and genuine care for her students' success. He noticed how the women's English improved rapidly under Greta's instruction, how they began offering careful good mornings to passing guards, how thank yous started appearing in their interactions with camp staff. The ice began to crack imperceptibly at first when Sergeant Riley received authorization to allow the women to participate in recreational activities alongside off-duty personnel. Margaret had lobbied for this permission, arguing that such interactions would reduce tensions and normalize the prisoners' daily existence in ways that pure military routine could never accomplish. She remembered how her own grandparents, immigrants from Ireland who had arrived speaking barely a word of English, had found acceptance in their new country through shared activities that transcended language barriers, church socials, and community barn raisings where work and play created bonds stronger than words could forge. "There's a card game tonight in the recreation hall," Riley announced during evening meal one day, his voice carefully neutral. "Nothing fancy, just poker. Some of the boys thought you ladies might like to learn some American card games." The invitation was extended with studied casualness, as if it were merely a routine notification rather than a carefully orchestrated attempt to build bridges across chasms of culture and recent history. Margaret watched from her office window as guards and prisoners arranged themselves around tables in the recreation hall that evening, the initial awkwardness palpable even from a distance. Corporal James Mitchell, a lanky farm boy from Nebraska, whose gentle manner and easy smile had made him popular among both his fellow soldiers and the German prisoners, took it upon himself to serve as primary instructor. He laid out the cards with the patient precision of someone accustomed to teaching, his explanations clear and his corrections offered without any hint of condescension. "This is called a full house," he explained, arranging his cards face up on the table so everyone could see. 3 cards of one rank and 2 cards of another rank. It's a strong hand, beats most other combinations except for 4 of a kind or a straight flush. The younger women, particularly Liesel Wagner, approached the game with infectious enthusiasm, their laughter breaking through the tension like sunshine through clouds. Liesel's attempts to pronounce the English names for various hands drew smiles even from the most reserved guards, her Bavarian accent transforming straight flush into something that sounded musical and foreign and somehow endearing. She giggled at her own mistakes, unself-conscious in her desire to learn, and her lack of pretension made it impossible for the American soldiers to maintain their emotional distance. The breakthrough that everyone had been hoping for without quite knowing how to achieve it came 3 days later, arriving in the form of crisis rather than celebration. Liesl collapsed during morning roll call, her legs simply giving way beneath her as if someone had cut the strings holding up a marionette. She fell heavily, her face striking the frozen ground with a sickening sound that brought everyone running. By the time they got her to the infirmary, her skin burned with fever that seemed to radiate from her like heat from a stove, and her breathing came in shallow, rapid gasps that spoke of lungs struggling against some invisible invader. The camp physician arrived within minutes, summoned from his quarters by a guard who recognized the potential seriousness of the situation. Dr. Harrison had practiced medicine in rural Iowa for 30 years before the war, had seen his share of influenza and pneumonia and every other ailment that afflicted farming communities where hospitals were distant and help was often hours away. He examined Liesl with the thorough attention he would have given any patient, his professional concern overriding any considerations about nationality or politics. His fingers probed her lymph nodes, felt the heat radiating from her skin, listened to her laboured breathing through his stethoscope, and his expression grew increasingly grave. "Influenza," he pronounced finally, his voice carrying the weight of experience that had seen too many young people succumb to this particular enemy. "She's burning up with fever, and I don't like the sound of her lungs. She needs complete rest, plenty of fluids, and constant monitoring. If this fever doesn't break within the next day or two, we could be looking at serious complications, possibly pneumonia." The news spread through the camp with the speed that bad news always travels, reaching every corner of the facility within hours. Sam heard about it in the kitchen as he prepared vegetables for the evening soup, the information delivered by a private who had stopped by to requisition extra hot water for the infirmary. The young man's concern was evident in his voice, and Sam found his own hands stilling over the cutting board as memories flooded back unbidden. His daughter Sarah had been about Liesl's age when she had come down with terrible fever during a bitter Montgomery winter, lying pale and listless in their cramped apartment, while his wife had wrung her hands, and his grandmother had prepared remedy after remedy from her vast store of knowledge passed down through generations. He remembered sitting beside Sarah's bed for 3 days and nights, watching her toss in fevered sleep, spooning broth and medicine between her cracked lips, praying with a desperation he had never felt before or since. His grandmother had finally broken the fever with a combination of willow bark tea and poultices and, most importantly, a particular comfort food she swore had healing properties beyond mere nutrition. Cornbread soaked in warm milk and sweetened with honey, soft enough for even the sickest child to swallow, warm enough to provide comfort, sweet enough to tempt even the most reluctant appetite. Sarah had survived, the fever breaking on the 4th day, and Sam's grandmother had nodded with quiet satisfaction, attributing the recovery partly to medicine and partly to the sustaining power of food prepared with love. Without conscious decision, Sam found himself preparing that same remedy now, his hands moving with the certainty of muscle memory as he crumbled cornbread into a bowl and poured warm milk over it, stirring in honey until the mixture achieved the perfect consistency. He carried the bowl to the infirmary himself, ignoring the surprised looks from guards who saw him leaving the kitchen during working hours, his steps slowing only as he approached the door behind which Liesl lay battling her invisible enemy. The infirmary was quiet except for the sound of laboured breathing and the occasional cough that racked Liesl's small frame. She lay under piled blankets, her face flushed with fever, her eyes closed against the weak afternoon light filtering through the window. Sam approached her bedside with the careful quiet of someone who had spent time in sick rooms, who understood that illness demanded respect and gentleness. He settled into the chair that had been placed beside the cot, the bowl balanced carefully in his hands, and waited for her eyes to open. When Liesl's eyes finally fluttered open, they were glazed with fever and confusion, struggling to focus on the figure sitting beside her, Her lips moved, forming words in German that Sam couldn't understand, but he recognized the tone of someone calling out for comfort, for familiar faces, for home. "Bitte," she whispered, the word barely audible, "please." And Sam saw in her face every sick child he had ever known, every frightened young person far from home and safety. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice carrying the gentleness that came naturally to him, despite his determination to maintain emotional distance. "I brought you something. My grandmother always said this could fix just about anything that ailed a young person." He lifted a spoonful of the milk-soaked cornbread, holding it steady while Liesel's fevered eyes tried to focus. "Just try a little bite. I promise it won't hurt you." Liesel's eyes moved from the spoon to Sam's face, and something in his expression must have reassured her, because she opened her mouth trustingly, accepting the spoonful like a child accepting medicine from a parent. The warm mixture slid down her throat, soft and sweet and comforting, in ways that had nothing to do with its nutritional content and everything to do with the care with which it had been prepared. She swallowed, and then her eyes widened slightly, fever-bright but suddenly more focused. "Danke," she whispered, the German word emerging instinctively but carrying unmistakable gratitude. She took another spoonful when Sam offered it, and then another, and for the first time since the fever had struck her, a small smile touched her cracked lips. "Es schmeckt wie." She paused, searching for English words through the fog of fever, like Hoffnung. Hope. It tastes like hope. From the infirmary doorway, where she had been standing unnoticed, Greta watched this entire exchange with her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the care in Sam's movements, the gentleness in his voice, the way he treated this young German woman with exactly the same concern he would show any sick child, regardless of nationality or circumstance. This was not merely a cook fulfilling his duties by feeding a patient. This was something far more fundamental, one human being responding to another's suffering with the most basic form of compassion, offering sustenance and comfort, because that was what any decent person did when confronted with illness and fear. The cornbread that had once seemed so strange, so foreign, so worthy of mockery, now revealed itself for what it truly was. A vehicle for caring, a tangible expression of the desire to heal and comfort. A humble food that carried within it generations of survival and hope, and the determination to nurture even when resources were limited and circumstances were dire. Greta felt tears prick at her eyes, shame and understanding flooding through her in equal measure, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had committed a terrible wrong that needed to be addressed, regardless of pride or embarrassment. The letter-writing privilege arrived in the third week of November, delivered by a Red Cross representative whose official credentials and formal paperwork bore all the appropriate stamps and seals. Margaret made the announcement during evening roll call, keeping her voice professionally neutral even as she watched hope bloom across the faces of the German women like flowers opening to sudden sunlight. Each prisoner will be permitted to write one letter per month to immediate family members, she explained as the women gathered close to hear every word. All correspondence will be reviewed by censors for security purposes as required by regulations, but personal messages will be transmitted through established international channels. The announcement transformed the atmosphere of the women's quarters overnight. For 4 months, these women had existed in a void of silence, cut off completely from the world they had left behind, with no way to know whether their families were alive or dead, whether their homes still stood, whether anyone they loved remembered them or mourned their absence. The silence had been its own form of torture, allowing imagination to fill the void with increasingly dark possibilities. Now, suddenly, there was the promise of connection, the possibility of news, the hope of reassurance that they had not been completely forgotten by the world beyond the barbed wire fences. Greta felt her hands trembling as she accepted the Red Cross stationery that was distributed to each woman, the crisp white paper seeming almost sacred in its promise of communication. 4 months had elapsed since her last contact with her sister Anna in Hamburg, 4 months of not knowing whether the shabby apartment near the harbour district where they had grown up still existed, whether Anna's 3 children were safe and healthy, whether any familiar landmark from their childhood had survived the relentless Allied bombing campaigns that everyone knew were reducing German cities to rubble. The uncertainty had gnawed at her constantly, a background anxiety that coloured every thought and disturbed every attempt at sleep. The women spent the next 3 days composing their letters with the meticulous care of artisans creating precious objects that must be perfect in every detail. Each word was weighed and considered, measured against competing desires to be honest while also providing reassurance, to describe reality without causing excessive worry, to maintain connection across an abyss that threatened to swallow them all. Greta wrote and rewrote her letter to Anna perhaps a dozen times, covering page after page with careful script only to crumple them and start again, never quite satisfied that she had struck the right balance. "Liebe Anna," she finally wrote in her neatest handwriting, "I am safe and receiving proper treatment in a place called Iowa, where the land stretches flat to every horizon like the sea we knew as children watching ships from the harbour. The guards follow all international regulations strictly, and we receive regular meals that include strange but filling foods, including a peculiar yellow bread made from corn that initially puzzled us, but which I have come to understand represents survival and resourcefulness in this country. The Americans are not the monsters we were told to expect. They treat us with a dignity that I confess I did not anticipate finding so far from home. Please kiss the children for me every single day, and tell them their Tante Greta thinks of them constantly and prays for the day when I can hold them again." Throughout the camp, a similar transformation occurred as the women clung to this lifeline, connecting them to the world beyond captivity. Voices carried a lighter quality during daily routines, conversations flowed with renewed animation, and even the mundane tasks of camp life seemed infused with fresh purpose, now that they had concrete evidence they had not been entirely forgotten by the bureaucracies that governed their fates. Sam found himself humming old spirituals as he worked in the kitchen, melodies his grandmother had sung during her own difficult years, his movements regaining some of the fluid grace that had disappeared after the cornbread incident. The fragile peace that had begun with Liesel's illness and was nurtured by the letter-writing privilege survived through Thanksgiving, when Margaret arranged for a special meal that included turkey and all the traditional American accompaniments. Sam had spent days preparing, his professional pride emerging from the shadows where it had hidden since that morning in October. He roasted turkeys until the skin achieved perfect golden crispness, prepared stuffing that included sage and onions and, yes, cornbread crumbled and mixed with other ingredients, made gravy that was smooth and rich and properly seasoned. He watched through the kitchen pass through as the women ate with genuine appreciation, their animated conversations in German punctuated by increasingly confident attempts at English phrases they had learned from Greta's daily lessons. "This is very delicious," Liesel announced in carefully practiced English, holding up her fork to display a bite of stuffing. "What do you call these yellow pieces inside?" Her recovery from the influenza had been complete, leaving her with even more enthusiasm and energy than before, if such a thing were possible. Her youthful openness had made her something of an unofficial ambassador between the German women and their American guards, her complete lack of guile making it impossible for anyone to maintain hostility in her presence. "That's cornbread stuffing," Corporal Mitchell replied with a broad grin, clearly pleased by her interest. "Same cornbread you ladies met before, just mixed up different with other ingredients." The comment triggered laughter, but this time the laughter carried warmth and shared understanding rather than mockery, the sound of people who had moved past initial misunderstandings towards something approaching mutual respect. Even Sam, listening from the kitchen, allowed himself a small smile, the first genuine expression of pleasure he had permitted himself in weeks. But December brought news that shattered the tentative harmony as thoroughly as a hammer shattering ice. The telegram arrived at Margaret's office just after sunrise on the first day of the month, the Western Union messenger delivering it with the apologetic manner of someone who knew they carried pain in their hands. Margaret's fingers trembled as she tore open the envelope, her eyes scanning the terse official language that conveyed catastrophic news with brutal efficiency. The Navy Department regretted to inform Samuel Washington that his son, Seaman First Class Marcus Washington, had been listed as missing in action following a naval engagement near the Philippine Islands. All efforts were being made to locate missing personnel, but Mr. Washington should prepare himself for all possibilities. The words seemed to swim before Margaret's eyes as her own grief surged back with overwhelming force, her gold star suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She sat motionless at her desk for several minutes, the telegram clutched in her hands while tears ran silently down her cheeks before she finally gathered the strength to deliver this news to Sam. She found him in the kitchen performing the morning's prep work with his usual mechanical efficiency, his hands moving through familiar tasks while his mind wandered in whatever private spaces gave him refuge from the present moment. "Sam," she said quietly, her voice rough with emotion she couldn't quite control. "There's a telegram from the Navy Department." The news struck Sam with visible force, his entire body seeming to contract around the blow as if he had been physically hit. His knife clattered onto the cutting board, forgotten among half-chopped vegetables, and his hands gripped the edge of the prep table so hard that his knuckles went pale. "Missing," he repeated, the word sounding hollow and strange in his mouth. "Not dead, missing. Which means he could be anywhere, could be hurt, could be—" His voice broke and he stopped speaking abruptly, unable to continue that line of thought without falling completely apart. Margaret wanted to offer comfort, but knew from personal experience that there were no words adequate to the occasion, no phrases that could transform uncertainty into hope or make the waiting any more bearable. She placed a hand briefly on Sam's shoulder, a gesture of shared sorrow between two people who understood loss intimately, and then she left him alone with his grief because that was all she could offer. 3 hours later, another telegram arrived, this one bearing international routing codes and the distinctive formatting of Red Cross communications transmitted through neutral channels. Margaret's stomach dropped as she saw Greta Hoffmann's name on the recipient line and recognized the careful German script of the return address. She had delivered enough of these messages over the past months to know what they usually contained, and her hands shook slightly as she went to find Greta. The German woman was in the common area helping Liesel with pronunciation exercises, their voices creating a small island of normalcy in a world that seemed increasingly determined to drown them all in sorrow. Greta looked up when Margaret entered, and something in the older woman's expression must have telegraphed the nature of her mission, because Greta's face went pale even before Margaret spoke. "Greta, I need to speak with you privately," Margaret said, her voice carrying the formal tone she used for difficult official business. The envelope in her hand seemed to pulse with the weight of bad news, and she saw terrible understanding flicker across Greta's features, the look of someone who had been bracing for catastrophe for so long that its arrival brought almost a sense of inevitability. The letter had been written by Anna's eldest daughter, a 12-year-old child forced by circumstances to assume responsibilities far beyond her years. Her childish handwriting wobbled across the page, forming words that no child should ever have to write. "Tante Greta," the letter began, "I must tell you terrible news. Mama is gone. The bombers came again in November, many planes, and our street was hit very badly. Mama had gone to help Frau Schmidt find her cat in the cellar when the bombs fell. We waited and waited, but she never came out. The rescue workers said the building collapsed completely, and no one could have survived. They took us to stay with Uncle Friedrich in the countryside because Hamburg is too dangerous now. The children miss Mama terribly and ask about her every day. I try to be strong like Mama would want, but it is very hard. We pray for you every night and hope you will come home someday." Greta read the letter 3 times, her eyes moving over the words as if repetition might somehow change their meaning or reveal some hidden message of hope. But the words remained stubbornly constant, describing an absence that would never be filled, a loss that could never be recovered. Anna was dead, buried under tons of rubble in a harbour district that no longer existed, and Greta was trapped thousands of miles away, unable to mourn properly, unable to comfort her nieces and nephews, unable to do anything except sit in a prisoner of war camp in Iowa and absorb the fact that her only sister had been erased from the world by forces neither of them had ever been able to control. That night, Camp Algona housed 2 people sitting in separate buildings, separated by barbed wire and culture and circumstance, but united in the particular anguish that comes from not knowing or from knowing too much. Sam sat in his small quarters, staring at an untouched dinner plate, his mind filled with images of his son somewhere in the vast Pacific, hurt or frightened or worse. Greta lay on her narrow cot clutching her niece's letter, her tears falling silently onto the thin pillow, her grief for Anna mixing with guilt that she had survived while her sister had not, that she was safe in captivity while Anna had died trying to save a neighbour's cat. The bridges they had begun to build between captor and captive, between cultures and individuals, suddenly seemed as fragile as spiderwebs in the face of these hurricane winds of loss that respected no boundaries and recognized no truces. Grey December settled over Camp Algona like a shroud woven from clouds and despair, bringing with it a silence that seemed to muffle even the constant Iowa wind. The routines continued because routines always continued. Roll call at dawn regardless of weather, meals served at prescribed intervals, lights extinguished at 2100 hours. But these activities had become empty rituals performed without meaning or purpose. Greta moved through her days like a woman walking in her sleep, her teaching sessions abandoned, her carefully practiced English falling back into German as she retreated into the language of her childhood and her loss. She sat for hours, staring at walls that offered no answers, her mind trapped in an endless loop of memories and regrets and the terrible knowledge that she would never see Anna again, never hear her sisters laugh or feel her embrace or share with her the small daily joys that sisters accumulate over a lifetime. Sam's kitchen became a monument to duty performed without heart, meals appearing on schedule because the army required meals on schedule, each dish nutritionally adequate and properly portioned because regulations specified nutritional adequacy and proper portions, but stripped of every trace of the intangible quality that separates sustenance from nourishment. He moved through the familiar routines with robotic precision, his face an expressionless mask, his interactions with other kitchen staff reduced to the absolute minimum required for functionality. The soup was always hot, the portions always correct, but the food might as well have been produced by machines for all the humanity it contained. The guards noticed the change, whispering among themselves about the cook who had lost his spark and the German teacher who no longer taught, about the pall of grief that seemed to hang over the entire facility like smoke from a fire that wouldn't quite go out. Margaret walked her morning rounds like a ghost, haunting familiar corridors, her office remaining immaculate because paperwork still needed to be filed and reports still needed to be written. But she found herself unable to enter the mess hall where too many memories lingered of brief moments when hope had seemed possible. The gold star on her lapel had been joined by an invisible burden, the knowledge that loss was a universal language spoken fluently by everyone within these fences, regardless of which flag they served or which uniform they wore. The first major blizzard of winter struck on December 18th, arriving with the sudden fury of nature asserting its complete indifference to human concerns. The sky had been grey and heavy all day, pregnant with the promise of snow, but when the storm finally broke shortly after sunset, it did so with violence that seemed almost personal. Wind howled across the Iowa flatlands like the combined voices of every ghost that had ever walked the earth, driving snow horizontally with such force that it found every crack, every gap, every imperfection in the camp's weathered buildings. Temperatures plummeted from merely cold to dangerous within hours, and by midnight the camp's aging heating system, overtaxed and under-maintained, began succumbing to the assault. Pipes froze and burst, boilers failed, and one by one the individual buildings lost their battles against the cold, until they became little more than marginally better shelters than standing outside in the storm itself. Emergency protocols activated with well-drilled efficiency, guards moving through the camp, rousing everyone from their quarters and directing them to the mess hall, the largest space with the most robust heating system and the best chance of keeping everyone alive until the storm passed. Improvised heating solutions appeared as soldiers dragged in metal drums and constructed makeshift braziers, feeding them with scrap wood and whatever combustible materials could be safely burned. The flames cast dancing shadows across walls and ceiling, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously primitive and oddly intimate, the barriers between people breaking down in the face of a common enemy that recognized no distinctions between victor and vanquished. Blankets emerged from supply stores and were distributed by guards who had stopped thinking about regulations and started thinking about survival, handing them to whoever looked cold without regard for whether that person wore an American uniform or German grey. The mess hall filled gradually with bodies huddled for warmth, American soldiers and German prisoners arranging themselves in clusters around the improvised fires, sharing coffee from thermoses, sharing body heat, sharing the fundamental understanding that freezing to death was a democratic threat that would kill them all with equal enthusiasm if they allowed artificial divisions to prevent them from helping each other. In this forced proximity, with death quite literally howling at the windows, the careful distances that had been so scrupulously maintained began to crumble. Corporal Mitchell shared his last pack of cigarettes with guards and prisoners alike, the small luxury of tobacco creating momentary warmth and camaraderie. Greta and another woman, whose English was still shaky, worked with an American private to secure a loose window that was letting in killing drafts, their combined efforts more effective than any individual attempt could have been. The artificial categories of nationality and allegiance seemed suddenly absurd when measured against the simple reality that they were all just people trying not to freeze to death in an Iowa blizzard. It was Liesel whose voice first broke the silence, emerging soft and tentative in the flickering firelight like the first bird singing before dawn. She began humming a melody that transcended language barriers, notes that spoke to something universal in human experience, to longing for home and safety and peace. The tune was one that nearly everyone recognized, a carol that had been born in an Austrian village over a century earlier and had somehow become the musical embodiment of hope during the darkest season. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, she sang softly, her soprano voice pure and clear despite the storm's fury. Alles schläft, einsam wacht. Sam's voice joined hers without conscious decision, the English words emerging as naturally as breathing, his deep bass providing foundation for her melody. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. The two voices wound together, creating harmony despite singing different words, finding unity in shared music that neither politics nor war could touch. Margaret added her voice next, then Sergeant Riley with his off-key baritone that nevertheless carried genuine feeling. Then Corporal Mitchell and a dozen other guards who remembered singing this same carol in churches and schools and around family pianos when the world had seemed simpler and more certain. The German women contributed their own version, their voices blending with the English words to create something that belonged to neither nation exclusively but to humanity itself, a proclamation that even in the midst of war and loss and devastating cold, something remained that could not be destroyed. In that moment, with voices rising together above the storm's howl, the mess hall became something more than a military facility, transformed into a space where shared humanity trumped every other consideration. The song faded gradually, voices trailing off one by one until only the wind remained, but something fundamental had shifted in that space. Some barrier had been breached that could not be easily reconstructed. In the silence that followed, Greta rose from her place near one of the makeshift fires, her body moving with purpose after weeks of aimless drifting. She walked through the clustered bodies with steady steps, her path carrying her toward the kitchen where bags of flour and cornmeal waited in their storage bins like raw potential waiting to be transformed. She paused at the threshold, looking back across the crowded mess hall until her eyes found Sam, who was watching her progress with an expression that mixed surprise and something that might have been hope. Please, Greta said, her voice carrying across the space with careful English pronunciation that represented months of dedicated practice. Teach me how to make the bread. The final word emerged weighted with significance beyond its simple syllables, carrying within it an apology, a request for forgiveness, an acknowledgement of understanding that had come far too late, and a desperate need to learn something that might bridge the gulf between them. Sam stood slowly, his joints protesting the cold and the hard floor where he had been sitting, but something in his chest loosening for the first time in weeks. He moved toward the kitchen, and together he and Greta passed through the doorway into that space that had been his domain and his refuge, their footsteps echoing in the relative quiet until Sam found matches and lit the gas burners. Golden light bloomed around them, pushing back the darkness as he began gathering ingredients with movements that carried the authority of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times. The first thing you need to understand, Sam said, his voice gentle as a teacher addressing a willing student, is that cornbread isn't trying to be wheat bread. It's something entirely different, something that comes from necessity and resourcefulness, from making do with what you have and being grateful for it. He poured cornmeal into a large ceramic bowl, then guided her hand to feel its texture, the grittiness that was so different from refined wheat flour. My grandmother used to tell me stories about slavery times, about how enslaved people were given corn because it was cheap and filling, and they made it into something that sustained them through unimaginable hardships. She said cornbread was survival made solid, hope made edible. Greta felt the cornmeal run through her fingers, and in that simple substance she began to understand something about resilience and creativity in the face of limitation, about making beauty and comfort from humble materials, about the ways in which food carried cultural memory and represented far more than simple nutrition. "Tell me more," she said quietly. "Help me understand what I mocked, what I failed to see." Outside, the wind continued its assault on the buildings, but inside the kitchen, two people who had been strangers, then enemies, then reluctant inhabitants of the same space, began the slow process of becoming something else. Sam talked as he worked, his hands adding buttermilk and eggs and a small amount of precious sugar while he spoke about his grandmother's kitchen in Alabama, about the Depression years when cornbread kept entire communities from starvation, about the generations of black families who had elevated this humble food into something that carried dignity and pride. Greta listened and watched and began to understand that every food carried within it the stories of the people who had created it, that to mock someone's traditional dishes was to mock their history, their struggles, their ingenuity in the face of hardship. They worked together through the early morning hours while the storm gradually exhausted itself, mixing batter and preparing pans, and finally sliding them into the oven while the gathered refugees from the cold dozed fitfully around the dying fires. The smell of baking cornbread began to fill the mess hall, warm and comforting, and people stirred from uneasy sleep, drawn by that most primitive of human responses to the scent of fresh bread. When the cornbread emerged golden and perfect, Sam cut it into squares and helped Greta carry them to the tables where people had begun to gather. She placed a piece on each plate with her own hands, and this time when the German women examined the yellow squares, they did so with curiosity rather than mockery, with respect rather than dismissal. Liesel took a bite and smiled, her young face lighting up with genuine appreciation for this food that had seemed so strange just months before, but which now tasted of survival and hope and the possibility of connection across every boundary that humans created to separate themselves from one another. The storm passed before dawn, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice into something beautiful and alien. The camp's heating systems were gradually restored, and people began to disperse back to their individual quarters, but something had changed fundamentally in that long night. Barriers had fallen that would be difficult to reconstruct, understanding had been reached that could not be easily forgotten, and in the kitchen, two people who had wounded and been wounded had found a path towards something that resembled, if not quite friendship, then at least mutual respect and recognition of shared humanity. Greta stood at the kitchen window as the sun rose over the snow-covered landscape, a piece of cornbread in her hand that she ate slowly, savouring not just the taste, but everything it represented. Sam worked beside her, already beginning preparations for the day's meals, but his movements carried a lightness they had lacked for weeks, and when he caught her eye, they shared a brief smile that acknowledged the distance they had travelled from that October morning when her laughter had wounded him so deeply. Outside, the Iowa winter stretched ahead with the promise of more cold and more hardship before spring would finally return. But inside the mess hall of Camp Algona, a different kind of spring had arrived, fragile and tentative but undeniably real, growing in the unlikeliest of places from the unlikeliest of seeds, nurtured by loss and watered by tears and sustained by the simple human need to find connection and meaning, even in the darkest of times.